Have you ever wondered why music moves us the way it does? Why a single melody can bring tears to our eyes or make our hearts beat a little faster, even when no words are spoken? From the moment humanity learned to make sound, music became the language of emotion, older than speech, deeper than logic, and somehow more honest than either. Long before there were cities or kings, before written words or carved stone, there was rhythm. The sound of wind in the trees, the pattern of waves against the shore, the heartbeat in our chests. These were the first teachers of music. When the earliest humans sat by the fire at night, the crackling logs kept time like a primitive drum. Voices joined together in rising and falling tones, echoing across the dark. That was the birth of song, not crafted, but discovered. Archaeologists have found flutes carved from the bones of birds over 40,000 years old. Imagine that. A human hand, tens of millennia ago, shaping an instrument to sing into the emptiness. The air passing through it was the same air we breathe now. The notes, though lost, carried the same ache for meaning, the same longing to connect. Even then, music was not merely sound. It was communication, an attempt to reach beyond words into something more profound. As humanity spread across the world, each culture found its own voice. In Africa, rhythm became the heartbeat of society, drums echoing the patterns of daily life, call and response binding communities together. In Asia, music took on meditative tones, each note a reflection of harmony between humans and the universe. In the Americas, songs became vessels of memory, carrying histories and dreams through generations. And in Europe, melodies began to evolve alongside myth, ritual, and the earliest hints of organized society. But no matter where or how it emerged, music always served the same purpose: to bridge the gap between the visible and the invisible. It turned fear into ritual, love into art, grief into remembrance. It taught us to listen not just with our ears, but with our souls. When ancient civilizations began to rise, in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Greece, and Rome, music followed them into temples, palaces, and homes. In Sumerian cities, musicians held positions of honor, performing for gods and rulers alike. Clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform show the earliest known musical notation, fragile symbols of an art already thousands of years old. The Egyptians believed that music had divine power. They used harps, flutes, and sistrums, sacred rattles that imitated the sounds of the gods. For them, to play music was to echo the harmony of creation itself. It accompanied every aspect of life: birth, prayer, work, and death. And when they buried their dead, they sometimes placed instruments in the tombs, as if the soul too would need music on its journey through the afterlife. In ancient Greece, music became philosophy. The Greeks saw it not merely as entertainment, but as a mirror of the cosmos. Pythagoras, the mathematician, believed that numbers ruled not only geometry, but harmony, that the distances between musical notes reflected the same mathematical ratios that governed the movement of planets. He called it the music of the spheres, the idea that the universe itself was singing, though we could not hear it. Plato and Aristotle both wrote about music's moral power. Plato believed that the right kind of music could shape the soul, teaching virtue and order. Certain modes, the Dorian, the Phrygian, were thought to inspire courage or temperance, while others were seen as dangerous to character. Aristotle agreed that music could stir emotions, but he also believed it could purify them, a process he called catharsis. For the Greeks, to understand music was to understand the soul itself. And as their theaters grew, so did their compositions. The tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides were performed with choruses that sang and danced, blending word, rhythm, and motion into one living art. The philosophers might debate what music meant, but the people simply felt it. In every note was a trace of joy, sorrow, and reverence for the mystery of existence. When the Roman Empire inherited Greek culture, it adopted music too, though more as spectacle than contemplation. Roman banquets and triumphs echoed with flutes, horns, and drums. Music became a symbol of grandeur, but also of control. The empire itself functioned like a vast composition, disciplined, structured, full of repeating themes. And yet, even in its might, it carried the same truth the Greeks had known, that harmony, whether in music or in life, depends on balance. After the fall of Rome, the ancient world faded into silence. But music never stopped. It retreated into monasteries, into the echoing stone halls of early Christianity. There, the human voice, unaccompanied, pure and solemn, became the vessel of faith. Gregorian chant emerged, long, flowing melodies without rhythm or harmony, designed not to entertain, but to elevate the spirit. If you've ever heard such a chant, you know how it feels. Timeless, serene, as if floating between earth and heaven. The monks who sang it believed that every note was a prayer, every interval a step closer to the divine. And though centuries have passed, that calm, meditative sound still carries the same quiet peace. Music had become more than art. It was worship, reflection, and order. But it was also waiting for the world to awaken again to curiosity, to creativity, to the rediscovery of beauty. As centuries passed, the silence of the monasteries began to open. Outside the cloisters, the world was changing. Fields, villages, cities, and kingdoms slowly came alive again. The Middle Ages were not as dark as they are sometimes imagined. They were an age of quiet rebirth, of order seeking beauty. And music, that old and faithful companion of the human spirit, began to take new forms. At first, it was still the sound of prayer. In cathedrals that rose like mountains of stone, choirs sang in long, resonant lines that reached toward the vaulted ceilings. The chants of earlier centuries began to split into harmonies, at first tentative, then bold. Two voices would sing the same melody, one slightly higher than the other. It was called organum, the birth of polyphony. From that simple act, one voice daring to move differently from another, came the revolution of Western music. It was as if the world itself had learned to breathe in two lungs, to dream in multiple colors. The monks who invented this did not know they were inventing the idea of harmony. They only knew that when two voices joined together, something miraculous happened. So over time, these harmonies became more complex. Composers began to write multiple lines that interwove like threads in a tapestry. This was the beginning of musical architecture, of pattern, symmetry, and design. In France, at the Cathedral of Notre Dame, two composers named Léonin and Perrotin transformed music into something almost mathematical in its beauty. They measured rhythm with precision, layering voice upon voice, creating structures of sound that mirrored the geometry of the buildings themselves. To stand in a Gothic cathedral and hear this music was to feel suspended between heaven and earth, surrounded not only by light, but by vibration. Each note lingered in the air, echoing against the stone, fading into the next like breath into breath. And though few could read or write, everyone could feel it. Music had become the art that united a divided world, the bridge between body and spirit. As the centuries turned, the world grew more curious again. The medieval mind, long fixed on the divine, began to rediscover the human. Trade brought new instruments and ideas from the East. The lute, the rebec, the shawm. Troubadours, poet-musicians, carried songs across Europe, telling stories of love, honor, and longing. Their melodies wandered from castle to tavern, from noble hall to humble hearth. It was through these wandering songs that Europe remembered its voice. For the first time, music was not only for God, but for people, to dance to laugh to weep to. It spoke of joy and heartbreak, of partings and reunions, of the simple rhythm of human life. By the 15th century, a new light began to spread across the continent. The Renaissance, rebirth. Painters rediscovered perspective. Poets rediscovered the self. And musicians rediscovered harmony, not only as structure, but as beauty. In Florence and Venice, in Paris and Antwerp, composers began to treat music as an art of emotion. They wrote masses for the church, yes, but also motets, madrigals, and songs for the court, full of subtle movement, of longing and grace. The human voice became the center of it all. Instruments supported it, but the soul was carried in breath and tone. Imagine standing in a candlelit room in Italy in the year 1500. A small ensemble gathers, a lute, a viola da gamba, a singer. The air is still. Then softly, the first notes begin. No amplification, no audience chatter. Just sound, pure and fragile, like glass. The melody rises and falls, and for a moment the world feels suspended in time. That was the power of Renaissance music. Intimacy and infinity blended together. It was during this age that the first composers became known by name. Josquin des Prez, Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina, Orlando di Lasso. Their music was filled with balance and clarity. Each voice moving with purpose, never overwhelming another. It was said that when Palestrina wrote, even the angels paused to listen. But something else was beginning too. Something that would change music forever. Notation. Until then, music had been learned by ear or memory, passed from singer to singer. Now, with ink and parchment, composers began to write down what they imagined. Notes became symbols, rhythm became measure, harmony became visible. For the first time, music could travel through time itself. A melody written in one century could be played in another. The composer no longer needed to live to be heard. Their thoughts could survive as marks on a page, waiting for another soul to bring them to life. And as printing spread across Europe, music became not only the privilege of the church or the court, but the possession of the people. A merchant could buy a songbook. A young girl could learn to play the lute in her home. Music was no longer the voice of the few. It became the heartbeat of many. With this democratization came new emotion. Love songs became popular, secular choirs flourished, and people began to experiment with instruments, building, tuning, refining. The violin family emerged in northern Italy. The organ grew larger and more complex. The harpsichord took shape. Each new invention added color to the palette of sound. And yet, beneath all the change, the spirit of the chant remained. That sense that music was not just sound, but reflection. Even as it grew more human, it remained a dialogue between the earth and the divine. By the end of the Renaissance, Music had become a universal language. It had rhythm, harmony, notation, and emotion, the four pillars upon which the next great age would rise. The Baroque era was coming, a time of grandeur, of motion, of light and shadow. The world was ready to hear not only the order of sound, but its drama. As the Renaissance faded into the Baroque, music began to shimmer with new color. The calm order of the old world gave way to movement, elaborate, emotional, and full of contrast. If the Renaissance had been about balance, the Baroque was about breath and heartbeat. It was the age when music began to move like the human spirit itself, restless, searching, alive. In the grand courts of Europe, music now filled gilded halls instead of cloisters. Composers became storytellers, architects of feeling. The music of this era was ornate, filled with motion and intricacy, like the spiraling patterns carved into marble or painted onto ceilings. Yet beneath the decoration lay a deep sense of purpose. The Baroque mind sought to capture emotion in sound, to give joy, sorrow, and devotion a musical form. In Italy, this transformation began with opera, a new kind of art that joined poetry, drama, and melody. The first operas were small and intimate, performed for nobles in candlelit rooms. But soon they became spectacles, vast productions filled with costumes, choruses, and orchestras. Monteverdi, one of the earliest masters, understood that music could express what words alone could not. His Orfeo, written in 1607, retold the ancient myth of love and loss. When Orpheus sang to the underworld to bring back his beloved Eurydice, audiences wept. It was something the world had never seen before. Not mere entertainment, but emotion sculpted in sound. Opera revealed a truth that still echoes today. Music tells the story of what cannot be said. Through melody and rhythm, it gives voice to longing, to faith, to grief, to wonder. Across Europe, instruments multiplied like voices in a fugue. The violin became the centerpiece of orchestras. The harpsichord danced beneath it, and the organ thundered in cathedrals. Music was no longer only vertical, harmony stacked upon harmony, but horizontal, flowing through time like a living river. Composers learned to build tension and release, to make sound itself feel alive. And then came Johann Sebastian Bach, a name that would one day stand like a mountain at the heart of music. Bach was not famous in his lifetime. He was a working musician, a craftsman of sound. But what he created went beyond any age or fashion. His music was both mathematical and mystical, a cathedral built of harmony. Each of his fugues, with their interlocking melodies, feels like a conversation between souls. He once said that the aim of music should be the glory of God and the refreshment of the soul. In his works, you can hear both. When he sat at the organ, his fingers seemed to speak a secret language. The lines of melody moved independently, yet formed perfect unity. Order born from freedom. It is said that when his contemporaries heard him improvise, they felt as though they had glimpsed the divine through sound. Bach saw music as an act of devotion, but also as an act of understanding. Each composition was a kind of meditation, a dialogue between mind and spirit. His well-tempered clavier explored every key, proving that all tonalities could coexist in harmony. It was more than an exercise. It was a philosophical statement that within the laws of order, infinite freedom exists. And then there was Antonio Vivaldi, the Venetian priest who wrote hundreds of concertos, each one like a burst of sunlight over the Canals, his most famous work, The Four Seasons, remains one of the most vivid portrayals of nature ever set to music. You can hear the birds singing in spring, the storms of summer, the harvest dances of autumn, the frozen footsteps of winter. Vivaldi's genius lay in his ability to translate the natural world into sound, to make violins mimic thunder and flutes whisper like wind. If Bach was the theologian of music, Vivaldi was its painter. And George Friedrich Handel, born in Germany, adored in England, was its dramatist. Handel understood grandeur. His music filled palaces and churches, coronations and celebrations. When he wrote the Messiah, it was not meant to impress, but to uplift. The Hallelujah chorus, with its majestic rise and fall, was said to move even kings to stand in awe. Yet beyond the splendor, Handel's music carried warmth, a humanity that made even the sacred feel personal. All three, Bach, Vivaldi, and Handel, shared a belief that music could touch the eternal. But they expressed it differently. Bach through structure, Vivaldi through color, Handel through emotion. Together, they defined the Baroque spirit, disciplined yet passionate, logical yet alive. During this time, the orchestra began to take its modern form. Strings became the foundation, supported by woodwinds, brass, and percussion. Conductors emerged to guide them, and music became a dialogue of many voices. The harpsichord kept time like a heartbeat beneath the surface, while the violin soared above, weaving melody into meaning. Even the architecture of music changed. Composers began to build pieces in contrasting sections, slow and fast, loud and soft, joyful and solemn, mirroring the contradictions of life itself. Music became theater for the mind. It could paint, speak, pray, or weep, and sometimes all at once. By the end of the Baroque era, music had reached a kind of perfection of design. But perfection, once achieved, begins to long for simplicity. Out of the ornate labyrinth of fugues and arias, a new sound began to emerge, one of clarity, balance, and grace. The classical period was dawning. The year was around 1750. Europe was changing again. Science and reason were now the new gods. Empires were expanding, revolutions were stirring, and the human mind was awakening to its own power. It was an age that sought order in all things. And in music, that order became beauty itself. The world of the 18th century was a world in balance, or at least it wished to be. After the intricate beauty of the Baroque came a desire for clarity, proportion, and grace. Music began to breathe more freely again. Where Bach had built cathedrals of sound, the new generation built palaces, elegant, symmetrical, filled with light. It was the classical era, when music sought to reflect not the mystery of the heavens, but the order of human reason. In this new world, the composer was no longer just a servant of the church or the court. He was beginning to emerge as an artist, a creator who shaped sound with personal intent. The ideals of the Enlightenment, logic, balance, harmony, found their perfect echo in the sonata form, that graceful architecture of themes, contrasts, and resolutions. It was music as thought, but thought that could still sing. At the center of this transformation stood two figures who, more than any others, defined the classical spirit: Joseph Haydn and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Haydn, often called the father of the symphony, spent much of his life in the service of the Esterházy family, wealthy nobles who kept their own orchestra. Yet within that constraint, Haydn found freedom. He experimented constantly, turning formal structures into playgrounds of wit and emotion. He was a man of good humor, often hiding jokes in his music, a sudden silence, a wrong note in the right place, a surprise that made audiences laugh. His music was orderly, but alive. He once said that he was forced to be original, for he lived in isolation and had to invent everything for himself. And in that solitude, he shaped the modern orchestra. The symphony, the string quartet, the sonata, all took their mature form under his hands. But then came Mozart, the prodigy, the comet, the eternal child of music. Born in Salzburg in 1756, Mozart seemed touched by something otherworldly. By the age of 5, he was already composing. By 8, he had written symphonies. His gift was not only technical, but spiritual, an effortless harmony between intellect and emotion. To hear his music is to glimpse the unity of thought and feeling, like sunlight breaking through glass. Where Haydn was the craftsman, Mozart was the poet. He understood that beauty could be both simple and infinite. In his operas, The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, The Magic Flute, he revealed the full theater of the human soul. Love and jealousy, laughter and despair, nobility and folly. His characters were not gods or myths, but people, alive, flawed, and tender. And his music treated them with compassion. Even his instrumental works, the piano concertos, the symphonies, the quartets, carry this sense of humanity. They sing with a voice that feels both divine and deeply familiar. There is never excess, never indulgence, only the perfect balance of motion and rest. It is as though he translated the architecture of the cosmos into melody. And yet, for all his genius, Mozart's life was not easy. He struggled for independence, for recognition, for stability. He died young at 35, buried in a common grave. But his music, delicate as it seems, proved stronger than marble. It became the very definition of beauty. While Mozart embodied the grace of the classical ideal, another figure was already beginning to challenge it, to break its symmetry from within. His name was Ludwig van Beethoven. Beethoven was born in Bonn in 1770, and like Mozart, he was a child of talent. But where Mozart sang with effortless clarity, Beethoven fought with sound. His music was not about perfection, but about struggle, the human will striving against fate. He inherited the forms of the classical era, but he filled them with a new kind of fire. In his early years, he was a student of Haydn, and his first symphonies followed the established patterns. But soon, something began to change. The neat lines of classical form could no longer contain the force of his emotion. He stretched them, broke them, remade them. By the time he wrote his Eroica Symphony, the world could feel the shift. It was longer, louder, more intense than anything before. The Eroica was not a polite courtly piece. It was a declaration. It marked the dawn of Romanticism, even before the word existed. Beethoven believed that music should express the inner life of the soul, its conflict, its courage, its hope. His own life mirrored that ideal. As he grew older, he began to lose his hearing. The very sense upon which his art depended slipped away from him. And yet, he did not stop composing. Instead, his music grew deeper. It turned inward, transcending sound itself. His Ninth Symphony, written when he was almost completely deaf, ends with the Ode to Joy, a choral celebration of human unity. It is a hymn to hope, written by a man who could no longer hear it. When it was first performed, the audience applauded wildly. But Beethoven stood still, unable to hear the thunder of their praise. Someone had to turn him toward them, so he could see their standing ovation. That moment has become one of the most moving in the history of music. The triumph of spirit over silence. Beethoven transformed music from entertainment into revelation. He showed that sound could carry the weight of destiny, that a symphony could contain the entire drama of being human. He once said, "Music is a higher revelation than all wisdom and philosophy." And in his hands, it became exactly that. By the early 19th century, his influence had changed everything. The classical age of balance had given birth to the romantic age of passion. Composers were no longer artisans serving patrons. They were visionaries, prophets of feeling. The orchestra grew larger, the harmonies deeper, the melodies more daring. The age of the individual had arrived, and music became its truest voice. The Romantic era was about to unfold, and with it, some of the most powerful, tender, and transformative sounds humanity would ever create. By the dawn of the 19th century, music had become something new. It was no longer only a craft of structure or a mirror of reason. It was emotion itself. It breathed, wept, and dreamed as humanity did. The world was changing rapidly. Revolutions swept through nations, industry transformed cities, empires rose and fell. Amid this upheaval, the human spirit sought a voice vast enough to contain its longings. That voice was music. The Romantic era was not an age of balance, but of intensity. It celebrated the individual, the artist as hero, the composer as visionary, the soul as infinite. The symphony hall became a cathedral of emotion. Every note was a confession, every melody a heartbeat. Where the classical age had sought order, the Romantic sought truth, even if that truth was painful, mysterious, or wild. The first great figure of this new world was Franz Schubert. He was born in Vienna, a quiet, gentle man who lived simply and died young. Yet, in his brief life, he wrote more than 600 songs. Small, perfect worlds of feeling. Schubert turned the Lied, the art song, into a mirror of the soul. He could take a single poem, make it live through sound, the rustle of leaves, the warmth of love, the chill of loneliness. One of his most haunting works, Der Erlkönig, tells the story of a father riding through the night with his dying child, while a supernatural being whispers in the dark. The piano gallops like a horse. The singer becomes all three voices, Father, Son, and Spirit. It lasts only a few minutes, yet it feels like a lifetime. That was Schubert's gift, to compress eternity into melody. At the same time, in Paris, another voice began to whisper, the delicate, poetic voice of Frédéric Chopin. He was shy, frail, and inward, a man who seemed to speak more easily through piano keys than through words. Born in Poland, he carried the melancholy of exile within him. Every note he wrote was touched by longing, for his homeland, for beauty, for peace. Chopin never wrote a symphony, never sought grandeur. His stage was the salon, his orchestra the piano. But within that single instrument, he found infinite colors. His nocturnes shimmer like candlelight. His waltzes float like perfume in the air. His music does not shout. It sighs. And yet, it lingers in the heart like a secret prayer. While Chopin whispered, Franz Liszt thundered. Liszt was the first true superstar of music, a performer whose presence caused hysteria. Women fainted, men shouted, audiences tore at his gloves for souvenirs. But behind the legend was a mind of astonishing depth. Liszt transformed the piano into an orchestra, creating sounds no one thought possible from 10 fingers. His compositions, the Hungarian Rhapsodies, the Transcendental Etudes, were both technical miracles and spiritual meditations. He once said that to play music is to render the soul audible, and he lived that belief. Yet Liszt's life also carried a deep religious undercurrent. In his later years, he took minor holy orders and wrote sacred works, quiet, luminous pieces that sounded more like contemplation than performance. He embodied the romantic paradox, the artist torn between the earthly and the divine. And then there was Robert Schumann, dreamer, poet, visionary. He believed music was the language of the heart. His compositions were diaries, capturing love, despair, and imagination. His Carnival paints a masquerade of characters, each one a fragment of his own mind. His piano works breathe intimacy, as if the listener has stumbled into someone's secret thoughts. But Schumann's life was marked by tragedy. He suffered from mental illness, haunted by voices only he could hear. And yet, even in his decline, he found beauty in fragility. His love for his wife, Clara, herself a brilliant pianist, inspired some of the most tender music ever written. Through him, Romanticism revealed its truest face: sensitivity, vulnerability, and courage to feel deeply. The orchestras, meanwhile, were growing. Instruments multiplied, concert halls expanded. Composers sought to fill these vast spaces with sound that could carry the full power of emotion. Among them rose Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, a man whose music speaks directly to the heart. Tchaikovsky's symphonies and ballets, Swan Lake, The Nutcracker, Sleeping Beauty, captured both grandeur and sorrow. His melodies seemed to bloom and break at once, like flowers trembling under rain. In him, we hear the dual nature of romantic music, the joy of life and the ache of longing. His Pathétique Symphony, written just before his death, ends not in triumph, but in quiet despair, as if he had glimpsed both the beauty and the sadness of existence, and could not separate them. At the other end of the romantic spectrum stood Richard Wagner, whose music sought not intimacy, but immortality. Wagner believed that music could be total art, a fusion of sound, poetry, myth, and stagecraft. His operas were vast cosmic dramas, filled with gods, heroes, and redemption. The Ring Cycle, his 4-part masterpiece, lasts nearly 15 hours and took decades to complete. It is not merely performance, it is universe. Wagner's harmonies shattered tradition. He stretched tonality to its limits, creating waves of unresolved tension that would echo far into the 20th century. His music, both adored and controversial, changed the course of Western art. He once said, "Music is the language of longing." And indeed, his chords seemed to yearn endlessly, forever reaching for resolution, forever suspended between earth and eternity. But while Wagner's sound filled the heavens, other composers returned their gaze to the earth. In Bohemia, Antonin Dvořák wove folk melodies into symphonies, turning peasant dances into poetry. In Norway, Edvard Grieg captured the mist and majesty of his homeland in gentle harmonies that smell of pine and snow. In Finland, Jean Sibelius transformed the loneliness of northern landscapes into music that feels like ice melting beneath the sun. Each of these composers, whether grand or humble, shared the romantic conviction that music is the voice of the soul. They believed that every human being, no matter how small, carries within them an infinite world of feeling. The 19th century became an era of sound as emotion, vast, colorful, and unrestrained. But as it drew to a close, something began to stir beneath its beauty. The world was changing again. Science was advancing. Cities were swelling. Old empires trembled. Composers began to wonder if music, like the world itself, could ever find order again. And so, quietly, the modern age began to rise. As the 19th century began to fade into twilight, music found itself standing at a threshold. The romantic fire that had burned so brightly was beginning to flicker, not because it had lost its strength, but because the world around it was changing faster than the composers who lived in it could understand. The century that had been driven by emotion and faith was giving way to one ruled by reason, science, and restless curiosity. The air was filled with invention. Steam engines, telegraphs, and railways had transformed the rhythm of life. The world was shrinking, and so too was the distance between cultures. Artists and thinkers began to wonder, if everything around them was changing, should music remain the same? In this atmosphere of questioning, composers began to turn inward once more. They searched for new forms of beauty, new colors of sound. The result was a musical world shimmering with transition, poised between the grandeur of the past and the mysteries of the modern age. One of the first to embody this new sensibility was Johannes Brahms. He was often called the heir of Beethoven, a man who carried the weight of tradition with quiet dignity. Brahms loved the old forms, the symphony, the sonata, the concerto, but within them, he found new depth. His music feels both ancient and timeless, full of melancholy and strength. Listen to his German Requiem, and you can sense the romantic soul evolving. The drama turned inward, the emotion distilled. Brahms believed that structure could contain feeling. And through that balance, he gave the 19th century its last great voice of serenity. But beyond Brahms, other spirits were dreaming differently. Richard Strauss, for instance, wanted music to tell stories, vast psychological stories. His tone poems like Also sprach Zarathustra and Don Juan were not just compositions. They were sound paintings. In Zarathustra, inspired by Nietzsche's philosophy, Strauss tried to capture the evolution of the human spirit itself, from chaos to consciousness. Its opening, a rising sunrise of brass and organ, became one of the most famous moments in all of Western music. And yet, while Strauss painted with bold colors, another composer began to erase boundaries entirely. His name was Claude Debussy. Debussy did not think of music as structure, but as sensation. He once said that music should be the space between the notes. To him, harmony was not a law, but a landscape, one that could shimmer, blur, and dissolve like light on water. He rejected the rigid logic of classical form and replaced it with atmosphere. His Clair de Lune, for instance, feels less like a melody and more like moonlight made audible. The piano seems to breathe, to float, to reflect, to drift. Debussy's work marked the birth of musical impressionism, though he himself disliked the term. Like the painters Monet and Renoir, he sought to capture fleeting impressions of life, not its outlines, but its moods. His Prélude à l'après-midi d'un faune is a dream in sound, half asleep, half awake, full of longing and haze. Debussy taught the world that silence is not absence, but part of the music itself. And then there was Maurice Ravel. more meticulous, more crystalline. If Debussy was a poet of mist, Ravel was a jeweler of sound. His works are crafted with delicate precision, every note placed as carefully as a brushstroke. His bolero, with its hypnotic repetition and slow crescendo, is one of the most recognizable pieces in history. It begins with a whisper, a single drumbeat, a simple melody, and grows until it fills the world. It is both mechanical and sensual, both human and machine. Ravel's mastery lay in his control. Where others poured emotion into chaos, he carved clarity from sound. His music, like that of Bach centuries before, proves that discipline and imagination are not opposites. They are partners. But even as Debussy and Ravel painted their shimmering soundscapes, something darker was stirring beneath the surface. The 20th century was arriving, and with it came a new kind of uncertainty. Old empires were collapsing, cities were growing restless, and the harmony that had once unified the world was beginning to fracture. Music began to reflect that fracture. Gustav Mahler, the last great romantic symphonist, felt it deeply. His works are vast, entire worlds compressed into sound. A Mahler symphony might include a folk song, a funeral march, a children's tune, and a cosmic outburst, all within a single movement. His music swings between ecstasy and despair, between the sublime and the grotesque. Mahler once said, "A symphony must be like the world. It must contain everything." And indeed, his symphonies do. They are spiritual journeys, questioning life, death, love, and God. His Resurrection Symphony begins in tragedy and ends with a vision of eternal life, sung by choirs that seem to rise from the earth itself. It is both terrifying and transcendent, music as prayer and prophecy. But as the 20th century dawned, even Mahler's vast vision began to feel fragile. The very language of tonality, the system of harmony that had guided Western music for centuries, was being stretched to its limits. Composers began to ask, what lies beyond consonance and dissonance? Beyond keys, beyond familiar chords? One of the first to leap into that unknown was Arnold Schoenberg. In Vienna, at the beginning of the new century, Schoenberg shattered the tonal system entirely. He introduced atonality, music without a key, without a central home. To many listeners, it sounded like chaos. But to Schoenberg, it was liberation, a return to pure expression, unbound by rules. He later developed the 12-tone technique, a method that used all 12 notes of the chromatic scale in equal balance, ensuring that none dominated the others. It was radical, intellectual, and profoundly new. Music had broken free from gravity. This moment marked one of the greatest turning points in musical history. For centuries, harmony had been a language that told listeners where they were, when a melody would resolve, when a phrase would find rest. Now, that compass was gone. Music had become infinite space, uncharted and strange. To some, this was thrilling. To others, terrifying. And so the 20th century became a century of exploration, of extremes. Some composers followed Schoenberg into abstraction, while others sought refuge in simplicity. Some turned to rhythm, to dissonance, to sound itself as the subject. Others, weary of modernity's noise, turned back towards silence and minimalism. But before those revolutions unfolded, the world would face its own dissonance, wars, revolutions, and change that would alter not just music, but humanity itself. And yet, through it all, music remained what it had always been, the voice of our deepest longing, our grief, our wonder. Even when words failed, even when the world fell apart, music endured. It always does. As the 20th century dawned, the familiar world of harmony, melody, and balance seemed to dissolve like mist under the glare of modern life. Cities grew louder, machines filled the air with clanging rhythms. Trains thundered, factories pulsed, telegraphs clicked, and humanity itself began to move faster than ever before. The pace of progress was exhilarating, but also disorienting. Music, the oldest of human languages, now had to decide how to speak in a world ruled by steel and electricity. It was a century of extremes, of invention and destruction, of beauty and chaos. And just as painters abandoned perspective and writers questioned language, composers began to question the very essence of sound. In 1913, the composer Igor Stravinsky premiered The Rite of Spring in Paris. Nothing like it had ever been heard before. Its pounding rhythms, clashing harmonies, and primal energy shocked the audience. People shouted, argued, even fought in their seats. Some accounts describe the premiere as a near riot. But beneath the outrage, something revolutionary was happening. Stravinsky had freed rhythm from the polite pulse of the past. He made it alive again, unpredictable, raw, elemental. The Rite of Spring told the story of an ancient ritual. A young girl dances herself to death to bring the earth to life again. It was brutal, but it was also sacred. A reminder that before music was art, it was ritual. Stravinsky's masterpiece pulled the 20th century back to its prehistoric roots. It was the sound of both modernity and the Stone Age colliding in one heartbeat. Meanwhile, across Europe, other composers were finding their own paths through the chaos. In Russia, Dmitri Shostakovich lived and worked under the shadow of totalitarianism. His symphonies are like coded messages, full of defiance hidden behind irony, sorrow disguised as triumph. During Stalin's reign, a wrong note could cost a composer his life. Yet Shostakovich found a way to make his music speak both to power and to the people. His Fifth Symphony, for instance, was officially celebrated as patriotic. But listeners heard something deeper, a portrait of fear, endurance, and quiet rebellion. The applause that followed its premiere was so thunderous that Shostakovich wept. It was the sound of a people recognizing themselves. In America, a very different musical revolution was unfolding. For centuries, Europe had been the center of classical music. But in the 20th century, the United States, with its diversity, its energy, and its openness, began to find its own voice. Aaron Copland became the musical storyteller of America's landscapes. His music sounds like sunlight over wide plains, like wind across an open horizon. Pieces like Appalachian Spring, Rodeo, and Fanfare for the Common Man captured something deeply democratic: the idea that beauty belongs to everyone. Copland used simple harmonies, open intervals, and folk melodies to create a sound that felt both new and ancient. He once said that his goal was to write music that made people feel they belonged to a land. While Copland painted the open sky, George Gershwin turned to the city streets. He fused classical composition with the rhythms of jazz, America's great original art form. In Rhapsody in Blue, the orchestra begins with a long, swooping clarinet glissando that sounds like a smile. Playful, urban, alive. It was 1924, and the Roaring Twenties were in full swing. Gershwin's music was the sound of a new world, confident, restless, and full of motion. Jazz itself had already begun to transform music at every level. Born in the African-American communities of New Orleans, it blended African rhythms, blues melodies, and improvisation. Figures like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and later Miles Davis turned personal expression into public art. In jazz, every performance is a creation, a conversation in real time between players. That idea that music could be alive, spontaneous, unpredictable, began to influence even the most serious composers. Back in Europe, a different kind of minimalism began to take shape, one born not of simplicity, but of exhaustion. After 2 world wars, after the collapse of empires and ideals, many artists asked, how can beauty exist after such destruction? Composers like Olivier Messiaen sought answers in faith. Captured during World War II and imprisoned in a Nazi camp, Messiaen wrote his quartet for the end of time for the few instruments available: a piano, a violin, a cello, and a clarinet. It is a meditation on eternity, written amid suffering. The music moves slowly, as if time itself had broken. Its harmonies shimmer, full of both despair and hope. When it was first performed, in that freezing camp, the audience was made of fellow prisoners and guards. Messiaen later said that never had he felt music so deeply heard. But others, like John Cage, took a radically different path. Cage asked the most unsettling question of all: what is music? In 1952, he presented a piece titled 433. It consisted of 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. The performer sat at the piano but played nothing. The sounds of the audience, coughs, shuffling feet, the hum of the room, became the piece. Cage wasn't mocking music. He was reminding the world that sound is everywhere, that listening is a form of creation. His philosophy was influenced by Zen Buddhism. The idea that meaning arises not from control, but from awareness. In a sense, Cage was doing what the earliest philosophers of sound had done, returning to the essence of listening itself. By the 1960s, minimalism had emerged as a new voice for a new generation. Composers like Steve Reich, Philip Glass, and Terry Riley stripped music down to its simplest patterns. Repeating rhythms, slow transformations, pulses that seemed to hypnotize. Reich's music for 18 musicians and Glass's Einstein on the Beach stretched time until it became a landscape. These works felt both ancient and futuristic, like the heartbeat of the universe itself, repeating through sound. Reich once said that repetition is not about boredom, but about discovery. That when a phrase repeats, your mind begins to notice the smallest shifts, the tiniest differences. In that attention, new worlds open. Minimalism, in this sense, was a form of meditation, music that breathed rather than proclaimed. By the late 20th century, music had expanded beyond anything earlier ages could imagine. Electronic instruments, computers, and digital recording changed how sound was made, shared, and heard. Composers could now sculpt tone directly, create infinite variations, and blend the natural with the artificial. Brian Eno, one of the pioneers of ambient music, described his work as music designed to induce calm and a space to think. His music for airports turned sound into atmosphere, endlessly looping, evolving slowly, never demanding attention, yet always rewarding it. Ambient music became the soundtrack of a world that no longer had silence, a reminder that stillness could exist even amid constant noise. As the century drew to a close, music was no longer bound by geography or genre. The symphony, the jazz improvisation, the electronic soundscape, all existed side by side. The internet would soon connect every melody, every voice. But before that digital dawn arrived, composers had already understood something timeless. That music in all its forms is not just organized sound. It is organized emotion. Every new technology, every revolution, every silence, they all became part of one unbroken thread that began tens of thousands of years ago, when the first human struck a rhythm on stone. Even after wars, even after silence, the song continued. It always continues. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, music found itself in a new world, a world of infinite sound. No longer tied to paper or performance, it now existed everywhere, all at once. From the small glow of a computer screen to the vast echo of a concert hall, from the heartbeat rhythm of a subway car to the hum of satellites in orbit. The modern age was a symphony without boundaries. But before the digital storm truly began, there was one last transformation, one that would forever change how we imagine sound itself. The birth of cinema. When the first films appeared in the early 1900s, they were silent, flickering images projected onto a screen. Yet, even then, there was music. Pianists and small orchestras played live during the show, guiding the audience's emotions. A sad scene might be accompanied by a slow, minor melody, a chase by frantic staccato notes. The music gave the images soul. Soon, technology caught up. With the invention of synchronized sound, film composers emerged as the new storytellers. Music became the invisible narrator, shaping what viewers felt without words. Think of Max Steiner's lush score for Gone with the Wind, or Bernard Herrmann's sharp, anxious strings in Psycho. Even without dialogue, we know what the heart should feel, because the music tells us. The 20th century's great orchestral composers, men like John Williams, Ennio Morricone, and Hans Zimmer, became, in a sense, the heirs of Beethoven and Wagner. Williams' sweeping melodies for Star Wars, E.T., and Harry Potter reawakened the grandeur of symphonic storytelling. Morricone's music for the good, the bad, and the ugly turned a Western into an opera of dust and silence. Zimmer, with his fusion of electronics and orchestra, gave us the sound of awe itself, the vast, trembling hum that defines our modern imagination. Through cinema, music reached billions of people, not as concert-goers, but as dreamers. A single theme could now become universal. The whole planet could share in the same feeling at the same moment, sitting together in the dark. And yet, beyond the theaters, another revolution was happening. Smaller, quieter, but perhaps even more profound. The invention of recording and playback technology had already transformed the relationship between musicians and audiences. For the first time in history, music could be heard without being performed. The gramophone, the radio, the vinyl record, and later the cassette and CD. Each new medium allowed the listener to carry music into their personal world. The symphony no longer belonged to the elite. It belonged to everyone with a pair of ears. By the time the internet arrived, that transformation was complete. Streaming made every note, every genre, every voice available instantly. From Gregorian chant to hip-hop, from Balinese gamelan to Icelandic post-rock, the entire history of sound now fit into a single pocket. Humanity's collective memory of music became, in effect, infinite. But with that abundance came a quiet paradox. When everything is available, what does it mean to listen? In the ancient world, hearing music was an event, a ritual. It required presence. A listener had to travel, to wait, to gather with others. The experience was shared, sacred. But today, music flows constantly, in elevators, in headphones, in supermarkets, behind every screen. It is no longer rare, and yet, for those who still truly listen, it remains magical. Modern musicians, aware of this shift, began to explore new roles for sound. Some returned to simplicity, to stillness, to the human voice. Artists like Arvo Pärt in Estonia wrote music of breathtaking restraint. His piece, Spiegel im Spiegel, Mirror in the Mirror, is little more than slow piano chords and violin tones, yet it feels infinite, like breathing itself. Pärt called his style tintinnabuli, meaning the sound of bells. It is the sound of peace, the sound of listening. Others embraced the possibilities of technology. Electronic music became not just entertainment, but art, a canvas for imagination. In Berlin's nightclubs, in Tokyo's underground scenes, in the bedrooms of teenagers with laptops, new genres blossomed: ambient, trance, synthwave, lo-fi. These forms blurred the boundary between composer and listener. Anyone could create. The democratization of sound gave rise to a new kind of musician: the producer, the sound designer, the digital sculptor. No longer limited by instruments, they worked directly with texture, rhythm, and silence. Music became fluid again, no longer tied to notation or tradition. It could be built from samples of rain, the hiss of tape, or the hum of the city at dawn. This was, in a way, a return to origins. The first humans had made music with what they had: stones, bones, wind. Now, after millennia of evolution, we had returned to that same spirit of play, only armed with technology instead of sticks. As globalization connected the world, musical cultures began to intertwine in unprecedented ways. The sitar met the electric guitar. African drums fused with orchestral strings. Middle Eastern modes found their way into Western jazz. The boundaries that once divided classical, folk, and popular blurred completely. Yo-Yo Ma's Silk Road Ensemble brought together musicians from dozens of traditions, proving that collaboration was itself a form of composition. The result was music that belonged to no single culture, but to all humanity. In many ways, this global fusion echoed the ancient philosophies of sound, the idea that music reflects the harmony of the universe. When a Balinese gamelan ensemble plays, each musician listens more than they perform, adjusting to the others until their rhythms merge into a single, shimmering whole. That same principle now guides modern musical creation: the understanding that unity is not sameness, but balance among differences. And yet, even amid endless innovation, one truth has remained constant: music, at its core, is human. It is made by breath, by heartbeat, by the fragile desire to connect. Every technology, every style, every revolution has been another way of saying, I am here, I feel. Listen. From the primal drum to the digital synthesizer, from ancient temples to streaming playlists, the story of music has always been the story of humanity itself. Our joy, our sorrow, our search for meaning. Even now, when we listen to a simple melody, we are hearing not just the present, but the past. Echoes of monks chanting in stone halls, of minstrels under starlight, of orchestras trembling before kings. Every song carries ghosts. Every rhythm remembers footsteps long gone. And when a note fades into silence, it is not gone. It simply returns to the great reservoir of sound from which all music comes, waiting to be heard again. In every age, music has done more than entertain. It has healed, united, and revealed. To understand the full history of music, one must also understand the human mind, the strange, intricate instrument through which all melody must pass. Music is not just something we hear, it is something we become. Modern neuroscience has tried to understand what ancient poets only felt. When you listen to a song you love, your brain releases dopamine, the same chemical that signals pleasure, love, and reward. But it's not just about feeling good. Music activates nearly every region of the brain, the ones that control movement, emotion, memory, and imagination. It is one of the few experiences that uses both hemispheres fully, weaving logic and feeling into a single thread. That's why music can move you to tears, even when you don't understand the lyrics. Your body reacts before your mind does. A crescendo can make your pulse quicken. A soft violin can slow your breathing. It is, quite literally, a language older than words, one that evolution carved into our very nervous system. Anthropologists believe that music may have predated language itself. Long before humans could speak, they could hum, tap, or chant. These early rhythms may have been how our ancestors communicated safety, affection, or belonging. A mother's lullaby, in that sense, might be the oldest song on earth, the original bridge between emotion and sound. Even today, when a child hears a melody and instinctively sways, they are tapping into something ancient, a pattern that has lived within us for tens of thousands of years. Music is how humans learn to be together. And so it is no surprise that wherever humans go, music follows. When ships crossed oceans, they carried songs with them, sea shanties, folk ballads, prayers. When immigrants arrived in new lands, they brought their rhythms, their dances, their instruments. The blues of the Mississippi carries the sorrow of African songs, just as Irish fiddle tunes echo the reels of Celtic pastures. Every migration adds another note to the world's vast harmony. This is why, when you listen to modern music, even the simplest pop song, you are hearing layers of history. The steady beat of a drum machine traces back to the hand on a stretched hide. The chord progression that makes you sigh was already known to monks and troubadours. The call and response of a gospel choir has roots in ancient communal chants. We are surrounded by ghosts of melody. Music has always evolved with technology, but technology has never changed its essence. When the electric guitar was invented, people feared it would destroy music's soul. When synthesizers appeared, purists said the same. But each time, the human spirit adapted. Not erased, but transformed. Because at its core, music is not the tool, but the intention behind it. The power of music also lies in its relationship to memory. You might forget a name, a face, or a conversation. But the moment a familiar tune begins, you're transported instantly to another time. The melody acts as a key, unlocking emotional doors long thought closed. Scientists call this the Proust effect, after the French writer Marcel Proust, who described how a simple taste or sound could awaken forgotten memories. In hospitals, music therapy has helped patients with dementia recall lost fragments of their past. A song becomes a map through the labyrinth of the mind. This connection between sound and emotion has also made music a kind of universal language in times of suffering. During wars, soldiers have sung to keep fear away. in civil rights marches, voices joined in harmony became a weapon more powerful than guns. In cathedrals, mosques, and temples, the faithful sing not to impress, but to feel close to something greater than themselves. When you sing, even softly, even alone, your heartbeat synchronizes with your breath. Your nervous system calms. Your body becomes, for a moment, at peace. The ancient Greeks understood this deeply. They believed music had moral power. Plato wrote that certain melodies could strengthen the soul, while others could weaken it. To him, music wasn't entertainment. It was ethics made audible. And in a way, he was right. The songs we choose shape our inner world. The rhythm we move to becomes the rhythm of our thoughts. Music can lift us or break us. It can remind us of what we've lost or help us believe in what might still come. That is why even silence can feel musical once you've learned to listen. After a long symphony, when the final note fades and the hall holds its breath, that stillness is not emptiness. It's the sound of awareness. The audience has become one organism, sharing a single moment of listening. That silence is part of the music too. In recent years, scientists have begun to explore something that ancient mystics already knew: that music and consciousness are deeply entwined. When monks chant in unison, their brainwaves begin to synchronize. When musicians improvise together, their neural activity aligns in rhythm. Music, quite literally, creates connection. It is the sound of minds resonating. That might explain why so many of history's wisest teachers, from Socrates to Confucius, spoke about music as a reflection of order in the cosmos. Confucius once said that when the music of a society is pure, its people will live in harmony. The idea wasn't mystical, it was observational. A culture's music mirrors its state of mind. When people live in balance, their songs flow gently. When they are lost, their music fractures. Today's world, with its noise and haste, reflects its own contradictions, digital perfection and emotional dissonance. But even here, music continues to offer something timeless: the promise of balance, the possibility of peace. Consider the rise of ambient soundscapes. Music designed not to demand attention, but to soothe it. These compositions, like soft sonic blankets, exist somewhere between sound and silence. They have no climax, no resolution, only gentle repetition, like the ocean breathing in and out. In an age of overstimulation, such music reminds us that stillness is not absence, but presence. Even sleep itself, the act of letting go, is easier when guided by melody. Slow rhythms, low frequencies, and warm harmonies can slow the heartbeat, calm the body, and invite rest. That's why lullabies exist in every culture. Every parent since the dawn of time has sung to their child, not to teach them words, but to teach them peace. And perhaps that's the real purpose of all music: not to entertain, not to impress, but to remind us that we are not alone. When two people hum the same note, even softly, their bodies begin to vibrate together. For a moment, they share the same frequency. Two separate beings resonating as one. That's what every choir, every orchestra, every audience seeks: that fleeting unity between hearts carried by sound. Even when the song ends, that resonance lingers. It hums quietly in the memory, like an ember that refuses to die. If you look far enough into the history of music, you find that its origins are inseparable from the sacred. In every culture, sound was once a doorway to the divine, a way to speak to what could not be seen. Long before cathedrals or concert halls, there were caves, mountains, and open skies. There, early humans lifted their voices and believed the gods were listening. Archaeologists have found flutes carved from bone dating back over 40,000 years. Some were made from the bones of birds, as if humans were trying to borrow the voices of the creatures that flew closest to the heavens. When those ancient flutes were played, they produced pentatonic scales, the same five-note patterns that still appear in folk songs from China to Scotland. It's as if, across continents and millennia, humanity shared one intuition: that sound could mirror the harmony of the world. In ancient Mesopotamia, priests sang hymns to the goddess Inanna. In Egypt, music was part of every ritual: harps, lutes, and flutes accompanying prayers to Ra and Isis. The Hebrew Psalms, still sung today, were originally chants. Verses meant not to be read silently, but to resonate in the air. Each syllable carried the vibration of devotion. To the ancient Greeks, music was cosmos in miniature, the audible pattern of order and proportion that governed the stars. Pythagoras, the philosopher and mathematician, believed that everything in the universe could be understood through numbers and harmony. He spoke of the music of the spheres, the idea that the planets, in their celestial motion, produced a sound too pure for human ears. To live virtuously, he said, was to align one's soul with that hidden music. This idea shaped Greek education for centuries. Music was not entertainment, it was moral training. The right melody could make the heart courageous, the mind calm. Plato warned against careless music, saying it could corrupt character as easily as it could ennoble it. In the Republic, he wrote that rhythm and harmony find their way into the secret places of the soul. Even the word music itself came from the Muses, divine figures who inspired art and learning. Each muse governed a different art form, but together they represented the flow of creativity from heaven to earth. To make music was to touch something immortal. When Christianity spread through Europe, it inherited much of this philosophy. Early church fathers saw music as a reflection of divine order. St. Augustine wrote that when he heard sacred chants, his heart burned with love and awe. He who sings, he said, prays twice. In medieval monasteries, Gregorian chant became the sound of prayer made pure. These chants, sung in unison, have no rhythm in the modern sense, no beat, no meter, no harmony. They rise and fall like breath. They are timeless, weightless. To hear them in a great stone cathedral is to feel space itself vibrate with devotion. The architecture amplifies the sound until it seems to come not from the singers, but from the walls themselves. Those chants were not meant to impress. They were meant to dissolve the self. The singer and the listener became part of something larger. In that sense, music was a kind of meditation, a way of quieting the mind to make room for the divine. As the centuries unfolded, music continued to accompany every form of worship. In Hindu temples, the drone of the tanpura creates an unbroken sound, a reminder of eternity. The ragas of India are not just scales, but moods, each designed for a particular hour of the day or season of the year. A morning raga evokes light, an evening raga, rest. The musician does not perform, but participates in the unfolding of time itself. In the Islamic world, the call to prayer, the adhan, remains one of the most moving examples of sacred music. 5 times a day, the voice of the muezzin rises above the city, reminding believers that life itself is a rhythm of devotion. The maqam system, with its intricate scales and ornaments, gives the voice infinite shades of emotion, joy, longing, peace. In East Asia, Buddhist monks use chanting as a form of concentration. In Tibet, deep overtone chants are used to create harmony between body and mind. In Japan, the bells of temples mark the passage of time with tones so pure that they seem to erase time altogether. Even in indigenous traditions around the world, music remains inseparable from spirituality. The drumbeat of Native American ceremonies echoes the heartbeat of the earth. The didgeridoo of Australian Aboriginals vibrates with the sound of creation itself. These are not performances, but acts of participation. The human voice joining the symphony of nature. What unites all these traditions is not doctrine, but experience. Across faiths and continents, music serves the same purpose: to make the invisible audible, to give shape to mystery. It translates silence into meaning. In modern times, even as organized religion declined in some parts of the world, this sacred impulse did not disappear. It simply changed its form. Many people now find transcendence not in temples, but in concert halls, in headphones, in the stillness of a single note. The stage has become the new sanctuary, the symphony, the new prayer. When audiences sit in silence before a live performance, there's a feeling that something holy is about to begin. The lights dim, the musicians raise their instruments, and for a moment, hundreds of hearts share one expectation. That too is worship, not of a god, but of beauty itself. Even popular music, with all its diversity and excess, often carries a kind of spirituality. A singer standing before a crowd, pouring their soul into sound, becomes a modern priest of emotion. The audience sways, sings, and for a few minutes forgets the boundaries of self. In that communion of sound and feeling, the old rituals are reborn. It is tempting to think that the sacred and the secular are opposites. But in truth, they are woven together by the same thread: the longing to connect. Whether one sings to the heavens or to a beloved, the act is the same: to bridge distance with vibration, to turn feeling into form. This is perhaps why music endures when other languages fail. Words divide, sound unites. Where theology debates, a single melody can reconcile. A chord can express sorrow and joy at once. A silence can mean acceptance. Every civilization has used music to say what cannot be said, to carry emotion across the fragile gulf of human existence. In that way, all music is sacred, whether it is sung in a temple, a tavern, or a child's room at night. And maybe that's why, even now, you can close your eyes, hear a few notes, and feel something wordless yet true, as if the universe itself were breathing softly through you. When you look back across the vast story of music, from the first rhythm tapped on a stone to the symphonies, songs, and soundscapes that fill our lives today, it begins to seem less like a history and more like a heartbeat. A single, endless pulse moving through time, taking different forms, but never truly stopping. Every era added its own rhythm. Every culture shaped its own tone. Every voice, from the shepherd's flute to the cathedral choir, from the jazz saxophone to the electronic hum of the present, became part of the same great breath. Music has always been the mirror of what it means to be human. It reflects our fears, our dreams, our need to belong. When people danced around the fires of prehistory, they were not simply celebrating. They were affirming that they were alive together. When monks sang in their cloisters, they were not merely performing, they were aligning their souls with eternity. When orchestras thundered across Europe, when slaves sang on distant fields, when a modern child hums in the dark before sleep, it is all one gesture, the soul reaching outward. And that reaching is what defines us. We are creatures of rhythm, of resonance, of remembrance. We measure our lives in melodies, the songs we grew up with, the ones that comforted us, the ones that marked love and loss. When words fail, music remembers for us. It carries what cannot be said. Even when civilizations vanish, their music lingers, carved into instruments buried in the earth, or passed down in echoes that transform but never die. Ancient scales whisper inside modern harmonies. Old prayers live in the rise and fall of new voices. The continuity is astonishing, as though humanity, across thousands of years, has been composing a single, endless song. And if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear it. It's there, hidden beneath the noise of daily life, a rhythm that belongs not to any one nation or time, but to existence itself. The steady pulse of the ocean, the wind sighing through trees, the faint throb of your own heartbeat. These too are music. Perhaps that is why silence, when you truly listen, is never empty. It hums with potential, the same potential that once made a shepherd lift a reed flute to his lips, or a composer draw a trembling note from a violin. In silence, the next song is already forming. Music teaches us this, that everything passes, and yet nothing is lost. A note fades, but its vibration travels forever, carried through air, through matter, through memory. The energy of sound does not die. It becomes part of everything else. So too do the songs of our lives continue, long after the last chord has fallen away. In that sense, music is a metaphor for existence itself. Ephemeral, fleeting, yet infinite in consequence. We may not understand why certain melodies make us weep, why certain harmonies seem to open something deep inside us. But perhaps understanding is not the point. Perhaps it is enough to feel that we are part of something vast and mysterious, something that listens back. The great composers and poets of every age have all touched that same mystery. Bach once said that the aim of music is the glory of God and the refreshment of the soul. Beethoven, when deaf and despairing, wrote that music revealed to him the divine in man. Even John Cage, the modern experimentalist who composed silence itself, believed that when you listen long enough, the world reveals its own quiet symphony. And you too are part of that music. Your breath, your heartbeat, your thoughts weaving through the air, as sound once did through stone halls and moonlit fields. You are both the listener and the instrument, both the silence and the song. So, as this journey draws to its close, imagine all of history. The flutes of the Ice Age, the choirs of cathedrals, the drums of empires, the violins of symphonies, the hum of electric strings rising together in one slow, endless crescendo. And then imagine it softening, fading, returning to stillness. The melody doesn't end. It simply becomes too beautiful for words. That stillness, the space after the final note, is where peace begins. It's the same peace that ancient singers must have felt beneath the stars, the same peace that echoes in the final chord of a lullaby, the same peace that lives quietly inside every one of us, waiting to be heard. And so, as you lie here now, let the story of music settle into you like a familiar refrain. Let each breath be a rhythm, each thought a tone, each heartbeat a measure. You are part of the oldest song in the world, the song of life itself. Good night.